Did he expect me to fall to my knees? The very moment I signed the divorce papers, my ex-husband, Michael Callahan, froze every single one of my assets. He must have imagined me penniless, sitting on a curb somewhere. But what he never dreamed of was the fact that for the past 8 years, I had been meticulously preparing for this exact moment. And when the full truth came to light, he would be too stunned to even speak. If you're interested in my painful counterattack, please subscribe and give this a thumbs up. Now, let me begin my story. The divorce decree in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The firm impression of the pen where I had just signed lingered on my palm. The smell of fresh ink on the documents mixed with the sterile, cold air of the Manhattan family court hallway, making my head strangely clear. It was not the kind of clarity that comes after crying until you have no tears left. It was the steely transparency of someone who had spent countless silent nights planning, knowing exactly what the next step must be. My ex-husband, Michael Callahan, stood there like a sculpture carved from pure arrogance. He had deliberately worn the one charcoal gray suit I despised most. When we were married, the days he wore that suit were always the days something bad happened: a gathering with his family where they picked apart my every word, or a business party where I was meant to stand behind him like a decoration. He let out a short, sharp laugh through his nose. Michael glanced at me, the corner of his mouth lifting into a cold smirk. "Think of it as a mercy from a former husband," he said. "I left you just enough to breathe." His voice was low, but each word dropped at my feet like a heavy stone. I didn't answer. I knew that whenever he spoke like that, a pair of sharp scissors was always hidden behind his back. Michael tucked his copy of the divorce papers into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if savoring a small victory. Then he stepped closer, so close that his warm breath brushed my face, but his words were like ice. "The joint credit card you were using was cancelled yesterday. I also unlinked your cell phone number registered with the bank, and the account I used to deposit your monthly living expenses has been frozen." I lifted my head. I gripped the corner of the documents with 2 fingers, so tightly that the edge of the paper bit into my skin. I deliberately made my voice tremble slightly, like a woman whose only life raft had just been snatched away in a raging current. Why would you do this?" Michael tilted his head slightly, as if I had asked an impossibly naive question. "Why? Because from this moment on, you don't have a single dollar to your name." He said it bluntly, without looking away. "I've already had the locks changed on the Upper East Side penthouse. I told the staff to have your things thrown into a box and left with the doorman. Oh, and about your parents in Queens, I heard they put their house up as collateral 6 months ago to cover your brother's debts. The bank is getting pretty aggressive with their collection notices." Each of Michael's words was not just an attack on me, but a deliberate gouge at my family's most vulnerable point. My parents were living on a small pension in the house they had worked their entire lives to pay off. My brother's business had failed, dragging the entire family into a financial quagmire. I had been quietly working to resolve that issue for years, not just because I worried about my parents, but because I knew that if Michael ever discovered my weakness, he would use it as a snare to tighten around my neck. Michael took a step back and crossed his arms. His gaze swept over my face, as if he were looking at something on the verge of shattering. "I just want to see," he said, "how you survive without me. Will you be sleeping on the streets? Or will you all gather in that house that's about to be foreclosed on and cry your eyes out? Go on, beg me. If you get on your knees, I might toss you enough cash for a cheap apartment somewhere out of pity." A few people walking by glanced in our direction. The passing stares felt like the points of needles, pricking at us. I lowered my head. I made my shoulders tremble slightly, as if I were trying to hold back sobs. I knew Michael was enjoying this. He was addicted to the feeling of watching others shrink at his feet. But he was wrong. I wasn't trembling from despair. I was using every ounce of my strength to hold back the cold laughter that was rising in my throat. 8 years. For 8 years, living as his wife, I learned how to stay silent when I was criticized. I learned how to be quiet when I was interrupted. I learned how to smile when I was insulted. Michael probably thought it was submission. No. It was me, measuring his every breath, documenting his habits, his weaknesses, and every single person who stood behind him. Like someone walking down a dark road, I had endured, patiently lifting every single brick to find the way out. I raised my face. My eyes were wet, precisely as much as I had calculated they should be. "Did you really have to go this far?" Michael laughed out loud, a sound of pure amusement. "I'm teaching you about reality," he said. He leaned in, his voice growing sharper. "The reality is, without me, you are nothing. The paperwork is done. Now get lost. You're an eyesore." With that, he turned his back on me. His shoulders were straight, and his stride was firm, like a man who had just taken out the trash. I stood there, watching until his black Escalade blended into the line of traffic and its taillights disappeared. Only then did I wipe my eyes with the back of my hand. There was only the faintest trace of moisture, which I had forced out myself. I picked up the small suitcase I had placed on the bench beside me. The suitcase was laughably light. Michael knew it contained nothing but a few old clothes and some trinkets. He would never have let me take anything of real value. He wanted me to be penniless, to come crawling back to him. I walked out of the courthouse. For a while, I just walked, like a person with nowhere to go. I stopped in front of a convenience store, fumbled in my pocket for some loose change, and bought the cheapest bottle of mineral water. As the cold condensation trickled down the plastic, my mind grew even clearer. I felt someone's eyes on my back. Michael was even more cautious than I had thought. He had someone following me. I took out my smartphone and, with a faint gesture of desperation, opened my banking app. I made sure to put a look of devastation on my face. My finger, scrolling through my contacts, paused on the name Michael Callahan, lingering there as if in conflict. But I didn't press the call button. I sighed and stood up, pulling my suitcase behind me. Somewhere, someone was recording this moment. They would report back to Michael that I was on the brink of collapse. I went down into the subway station. I passed through several stops, leaving the glittering skyscrapers of Midtown behind and heading toward the older neighborhoods of the outer boroughs. I didn't go to my parents' house. I couldn't. If Michael found out I had sought help from my family, he would hold them hostage. I knocked on a first-floor door of a small apartment building. The person who opened it was Sarah, my best friend from college. The moment she saw me with the suitcase, her eyes reddened. She pulled me inside and hugged my shoulders tightly, as if I were made of glass. "Oh my God, Ellie. It's really over?" Sarah's voice trembled. "That man, did he really just throw you out? With nothing?" I put down my suitcase and hugged her back tightly. I patted her on the back. "Don't cry." Sarah looked at me, her eyes a mixture of anger and fear. "Don't cry? Ellie, what are you going to do? You have no job, no money. You've been a housewife for 8 years. How are you going to survive?" I sat down on an old wooden chair and accepted the cup of warm tea she handed me. The warmth soothed the coldness in my palms. I looked Sarah in the eyes and spoke slowly and clearly, in a voice so calm, it surprised even me. "I have a place to live." Sarah looked stunned. "A place to live? Ellie, don't push yourself." I opened my old handbag, the one I'd carried for years, its corners frayed. I reached into the innermost lining, a spot I had restitched with tiny, almost invisible stitches. Inside was an old flip phone. I took it out and placed it on the table, as if revealing a long-held secret. When I pressed the power button, a pale blue screen lit up. I pressed the only speed dial number saved in it. The call connected almost instantly. A crisp, professional woman's voice came on the line. "Eleanor, is everything proceeding as planned?" I glanced down at the divorce decree still in my hand. Then I looked toward the door, as if I could still see the shadow of the departing Escalade. The corner of my mouth lifted into a slight smile. There was not a shred of warmth in it. "Yes, exactly as planned," I said, each word as light as the wind but as solid as a stone. "The revenge plan officially begins now. Tell each department to proceed at the precise time. And remember one thing, you must let him believe I am at rock bottom." Sarah stood frozen. She was staring at me as if she were looking at a stranger. "Ellie, you..." I ended the call, put the flip phone back in its hidden compartment, and closed the bag with a snap. I turned to Sarah and gave a faint smile. It was enough of a smile to make her understand that this was no longer an ordinary divorce. "Sarah, until I contact you, don't look for me. Don't tell anyone you saw me. Especially not my parents or anyone from Michael Callahan's family." Sarah's mouth was open, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm scared for you." I nodded. "I'm scared too. But being scared doesn't mean I can stop." I stood up and picked up my featherlight suitcase. Before I left, I paused at the door. A cold wind seemed to rush through me, but it wasn't from despair. It was from the feeling that the time had finally come. I looked back at Sarah one last time. "Thank you for being here for me," I said. "A storm is coming." I stepped outside, blending into the late afternoon haze, the sound of traffic, and the dusty smell of the city. I deliberately walked past a few intersections with security cameras, letting them record the image of a recently divorced woman, dragging a suitcase, completely lost. When I was certain no one was directly following me anymore, I stopped on a quiet corner, took out the flip phone, and sent a short text message. "Objective activated. Maintain persona of poverty with maximum realism. Continue psychological pressure. Leaks are forbidden. I put the phone away and took a deep breath. Michael Callahan said he wanted to see how I would survive without money. Fine. I would show him. But by the time he realized what was happening, he would be the one with nowhere left to run. That night, I didn't go to the safe house apartment I had prepared. If Michael already had people watching me, I had to show them exactly what he wanted to see. A woman, freshly divorced, without money or connections, desperately scrambling to find a place to stay. I rented a room in a rundown walk-up in the Bronx for $800 a month. The walls were stained, the steel door was rusted, and the hallway was so dark you had to feel your way forward. The room was less than 100 square feet. A squeaky metal bed, a plastic desk with a wobbly leg, and an old fan that groaned as it turned. The bathroom was a shared one at the end of the hall, requiring slippers and a bit of courage for every visit. I put down my suitcase and looked around. The damp air made my skin crawl, but I calmly made the bed, wiped down the desk, and opened the window for ventilation. I knew that somewhere, a camera lens was recording this scene. A woman who had lost everything but was still trying to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. To them, it would look like a pathetic display of pride. To me, it was part of the plan. Every action had to be natural enough, and convincing enough. The next day, I put on an old shirt and faded jeans. I wore no makeup and tied my hair back in a low ponytail. I went to a small counseling center in the neighborhood. At the front desk, I spoke with a slightly hoarse voice and an anxious gaze. "My name is Eleanor, I have an appointment." In the counseling room, I sat across from a therapist named Dr. Evans. I told her a carefully edited version of the truth. 8 years of financial dependency, neglect, severed relationships, a loss of self-confidence, a loss of direction. I wasn't lying, exactly. I just wasn't telling the whole truth. Dr. Evans listened and took notes. "So you feel you've lost faith in yourself," she said. I looked down at my hands and gave a small nod. "Yes." My voice was barely a whisper. The session lasted an hour. When I left the center, I received a document proving I was undergoing psychological counseling. That piece of paper would be an excellent cover, a shield to fill the 8-year gap in my career. If needed, I could use it to explain my life as a housewife in a reasonable and sympathetic way. That afternoon, I went into an old diner and ordered the cheapest $10 lunch special. I ate slowly, occasionally glancing at my phone as if waiting for an email. I knew all of this would be reported. Eleanor is eating a $10 meal. Eleanor is looking at job sites. Eleanor looks exhausted. Back in my room, I took out the flip phone. Everything is going smoothly. As soon as I sent the message, a reply came back. "Surveillance team still on you. Confirmed lunch and therapy session. He seems pleased." I smiled faintly. I'm glad he's pleased. A man who believes he controls the board is a man who lets his guard down. 3 days later, I received a call from a mid-sized media company in Midtown. It was an invitation for an interview for an executive assistant position. I had never applied there. I immediately understood that this was bait. Michael wanted to see how I would react to an opportunity that seemed out of reach for my current situation. I went to the interview. That morning, I chose the nicest outfit from my suitcase, but it was clearly not new. I used a little concealer to hide the dark circles under my eyes, but left a hint of weariness. During the interview, 2 men asked me sharp questions. "You have a significant gap in your resume. We need someone who has maintained a consistent career path." I looked down and said in a small voice, "I understand. I'm just hoping for a chance to start over." I deliberately emphasized the word, chance. I answered the questions correctly but not exceptionally. I feigned hesitation on a few points. I knew the report that would reach Michael would read, "Eleanor. Abilities are average. Lacks confidence. Not competitive." The interview ended with a perfunctory handshake. I left the building. The midday New York sun beat down on my face. I paused for a moment on the steps and took out the flip phone. Bait test successful. They were his people. The media company is connected to Callahan's firm. Continue information gathering. That evening, I got a call from my mother. "Ellie, are you really divorced?" Her voice trembled over the phone. I could hear the sound of a fan whirring in the background. "Yes. The Callahans called. They said I was out of my depth, that I had nowhere to go." I gripped the phone tightly. "Mom, I'm fine. I'm staying with a friend. I have $200, honey. Should I send it to you?" My chest tightened. My parents lived on a meager pension. $200 was not a small amount for them. I don't need it, Mom. Ellie, don't be stubborn. I took a deep breath. Mom, for once, just listen to me. Don't take any more calls from that family. If they bring up money, just say you need time. And do not, under any circumstances, sign any documents. My mother was silent for a moment. What on earth are you doing? I stared at the mottled stains on the ceiling of my apartment. They looked like a gray map. I'm just trying to survive. I hung up the phone and leaned my back against the wall. If Michael thought hearing my parents' worried voices would make me break, he was wrong again. It was precisely for my parents that I could not afford to fail even once. A week later, the first piece of news about the project Michael was pouring a massive amount of capital into began to circulate. A short post on a financial forum raised questions about a legal issue with the site of a factory being built in the Meadowlands. The post was quickly deleted, but it was enough to cause a stir among a few small-time investors. I read the news on my smartphone, the one with the frozen bank account. My heart was calm. I hadn't spread the rumor. I just knew that the rumor would appear at exactly the right time. That night, in my 100-square-foot room, I sat on the metal bed and opened an old laptop. The pale blue light illuminated my face. I double-checked all the connections, the flow of funds, the contracts, the intermediaries. Everything was like chess pieces already in place, just waiting for a light touch. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't tired. The next morning, I went to a local market and bought vegetables that were on sale. I deliberately haggled over a few dollars. The vendor laughed at me sympathetically. I let them pity me. Pity is the best camouflage. In the afternoon, I ran into Michael's mother, Mrs. Callahan, in front of a high-end salon on Madison Avenue. She was just leaving with her friends, dressed in a vibrant designer dress, her hair impeccably styled. She stopped when she saw me holding a grocery bag full of cheap vegetables. Her gaze slid from the top of my head to the tips of my shoes. Well, if it isn't Eleanor. Her voice was high and shrill. What is my former daughter-in-law doing in a place like this? Her friends whispered amongst themselves. I looked down and said nothing. I heard you were thrown out of the house. I didn't answer. Mrs. Callahan took a $50 bill from her purse and held it out in front of me, as if making an offering. Here, take this. Buy yourself some decent clothes. Don't go around embarrassing our family. I looked at the bill, and then at her. My heart beat slowly. I couldn't be too strong, nor too weak. I gently pushed her hand away. I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept it. My voice was quiet but clear. I don't need his money anymore. The air around us froze for a few seconds. A flash of anger crossed Mrs. Callahan's face. I bowed my head slightly, then walked straight past them. I knew this scene would be recounted to Michael at the dinner table. He would think I was clinging to pointless pride. He would be even more convinced that I was in a position of weakness, with nothing left but a fragile ego. That was exactly what I wanted him to believe. That night, I received a message. He heard about the salon incident. He seems pleased. I put the phone down and looked out the small window, where a streetlight cast a yellow, striped pattern on the wall. Keep smiling, Michael. Just a little longer. I lay down on the metal bed, my eyes open in the darkness. My performance of poverty had only just begun. And when the curtain finally fell, I wouldn't be the one left with nothing. After the encounter with Mrs. Callahan, everything proceeded as I had predicted. For 3 consecutive days, the person watching me changed, but their methods remained the same. A man on a gray motorcycle was always parked about 30 feet from my apartment building. Wearing a helmet pulled down low, he would pretend to be reading news on his phone. I never looked at him directly. I would just walk past, my back slightly hunched, carrying my bag of vegetables, my pace unhurried. I had to make them believe that I was simply enduring, day by day. But while this performance was ongoing, another current was moving silently beneath the surface. I started taking on small freelance jobs through the internet: translation, report editing, analysis, even helping a few startups with their investment proposals. My name never appeared anywhere. Everything was processed through an intermediary account set up in Sarah's name. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain my life and, more importantly, to keep my mind from getting rusty. At night, in that 100-square-foot room, I sat in front of my laptop. The white light illuminated the plastic desk. I opened the file on the project Michael was pouring capital into. A development project in an industrial park in the Meadowlands. It was being promoted as a golden opportunity to attract foreign capital. On the surface, everything looked fine. But digging deeper, I saw familiar flaws. The zoning permit for the land was not yet finalized. The intermediary companies had a history of questionable dealings, and a foreign partner firm from Singapore had been involved in legal disputes. I hadn't spread the rumors. I was just the person who knew exactly where to press. A week later, I received an email from a well-known private equity firm in New York. The sender was the assistant to the firm's chairman, Arthur Vance. They had seen an analysis report I had anonymously created through a freelance platform, and wanted to hear more. I read the email 3 times. The name Arthur Vance was familiar. He was known for being a cool-headed operator with immense influence in the financial world, though he kept a low media profile. If I could get into his orbit, I would be closer to the center of the game. I knew this could be a real opportunity, or it could be another trap set by Michael. I sent back a humbly worded reply, confirming a meeting at their office building on Wall Street. That morning, I didn't wear my old clothes. I chose a simple white blouse and well-fitting black slacks. I tied my hair back neatly. I wanted to look presentable, but not flashy. I stood in front of the small mirror in my room and looked into my own eyes. The weary expression I had carefully crafted over the past 2 weeks was gone. In its place was pure focus. The firm's office was on the 32nd floor of a skyscraper whose blue glass reflected the sky. As I entered the lobby, I smelled a faint scent of expensive cologne and heard the click of high heels on the marble floor. The elevator carried me up to the 32nd floor. As the numbers rose, my heart grew calmer. I couldn't let myself be rattled. The conference room door opened. The man sitting at the head of the table didn't look that old, perhaps in his mid-40s. He wore a dark navy suit, and his gaze was deep and steady. He stood up from his seat but didn't immediately offer a handshake. He just watched me for a few seconds, as if sizing me up. "Miss Eleanor Abbott," he said. His voice was low and firm. "Yes." I walked forward and placed a stack of prepared documents on the table. "I understand you've done some independent analysis on the Meadowlands Industrial Park project." I gave a small nod. "I have a few personal insights." Mr. Vance gestured for me to sit. "Tell me about them." There were no long, formal greetings. I opened my laptop and explained, one point at a time. The questionable legal structure, the risk associated with the partner firm, the potential for a cash flow crunch if foreign investors pulled out. I didn't exaggerate. I just presented the data and my concise conclusions. He didn't interrupt me, only occasionally asking very specific questions. "If you were the head of this fund, what would you do?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I would temporarily halt the disbursement of funds and request a second legal review through an independent law firm. And I would ensure our contract has clauses that protect our capital before making any long-term commitments." The conference room was silent for a few seconds. Mr. Vance gave a small nod. "Where did you work before this?" "For the past 8 years, I was a homemaker," I said honestly. "Before that, I was an analyst at an investment bank." He studied me for a longer moment. "Why did you leave?" I paused for a beat. "For my marriage." He didn't ask any more questions. His gaze seemed to understand more than what I had said. The meeting lasted about an hour. As I stood up to leave, Mr. Vance stopped me with a single sentence. "Would you be interested in working with me?" I tried not to let the surprise show on my face. "In what capacity?" "As an independent analytical consultant, to start. A 3-month contract. If the results are good, we can discuss what comes next." 3 months. It was enough time to dive deep into their information network, to access documents I could never touch otherwise. "Yes, I would be happy to," I replied in a calm voice. He smiled faintly. "Then let's start next week." When I left the building, the sun was shining brightly on the asphalt of Wall Street. I walked slowly, like someone who had just finished a normal interview. But inside me, a door had already opened. That night, I returned to my apartment as usual. I still stopped at the old diner, paid with cash, and walked past the man on the gray motorcycle. I made them believe that nothing had changed. But that night, when the city was quiet, I opened my flip phone. Phase 2 initiated. The transformation was swift. "Understood." I leaned against the wall, remembering Arthur Vance's gaze. He wasn't the type to trust easily. He had chosen me not out of sympathy, but for the value I brought. That fact reassured me more than any words of encouragement. 2 days later, I got a message from Sarah. Michael was bragging to his partners that the Meadowlands project was about to attract a huge investment. He was acting super confident. I smiled faintly. Confidence is a good thing. When a man is at the peak of his confidence, he is less likely to notice the cracks beneath his feet. I stood up and went out onto the narrow balcony at the end of the apartment hallway. The night breeze carried the smell of car exhaust and the distant sound of laughter. I looked up at the New York City sky. The city lights had erased the stars. For 8 years, I had stood behind Michael, quietly watching the way he signed contracts, the way he handled crises, and the way he worshipped the power of money. He never believed in the power of patience. But I had all the patience in the world. I would read the reports that Michael never wanted anyone to read closely. I would see the real numbers hidden behind the glossy facade. And when the time came, with just a light touch, the entire edifice built on his confidence would begin to shake. I went back into my room and closed the door. The performance of poverty had to continue. But behind the scenes, I had already stepped into another room, one with brighter lights and newly arranged chess pieces. The first week on the 32nd floor passed like a well-oiled machine. Arthur Vance's investment fund office wasn't noisy like other financial firms. People here spoke in low voices, typed with light keystrokes, and spent more time looking at their monitors than at each other. There was tension, but no chaos. I liked that. I was given a desk by the window overlooking the streets of the financial district. The city looked small from up here. The skyscrapers gleamed under the sun, and the cars were like an endless stream of colored lines. I told myself not to be mesmerized by the view. I wasn't here to admire the scenery. On the second day, I attended an internal meeting about the investment portfolio for the next quarter. The Meadowlands Industrial Park project was third on the list. When the slide appeared on the screen, Michael's company logo was clearly visible. The projected growth figures presented alongside it were incredibly optimistic. One of the analysts said, "They've assured us that if we get in early, the projected returns are excellent." I didn't speak immediately. I waited until Arthur Vance turned to me. "Eleanor, any thoughts?" All eyes turned to me. I could feel my heart beating, but my voice was steady. "I propose we put a 2-week hold on the fund disbursement." The room fell silent. "We should re-examine the legal issues with the site and the credit history of their foreign partner." Another employee frowned. "That's already been vetted." I nodded. "Vetted at a routine level, I'm sure. I want to vet it more deeply." Mr. Vance didn't ask any further questions. He simply said, "We'll give Miss Abbott 2 weeks." With that one decision, I was given the space to operate. I started working as if the 8-year gap in my career had never existed. I contacted old colleagues at law firms and had them look into the land zoning documents. I reached out to a specialist who used to work in Singapore and asked about the foreign partner firm. I carefully documented every small piece of information. Like peeling an onion, I stripped away one layer after another. And then the cracks began to appear. The foreign partner firm had been sued in the past for allegedly concealing debt. The legal documents for the site showed that although Michael's company was advertising that everything was finalized, the zoning change was still pending approval. There was also an obscure financial relationship between one of the intermediary companies and an individual who had been investigated for tax evasion. I sat in front of my monitor, staring at the data as it came to light. I felt no satisfaction, only certainty. Michael wasn't a fool. He knew there were risks, but he believed he could control them. He had always believed that. In the evenings, I would return to my rundown apartment. I still ate at the old diner and wore my simple clothes. The man watching me was still there. The gray motorcycle was parked a few dozen feet away. I made them believe that I was working at a small, nearby company. I deliberately took a different route home, making them think I had a simple, temporary office job. But from Monday to Friday, I was ascending to the 32nd floor. A week later, a second article about the Meadowlands project appeared on an economic news website. This time, it wasn't an anonymous forum post. The article raised questions about the transparency of the capital structure. It didn't draw any conclusions, it just presented possibilities. But in the financial world, presenting a possibility is often enough to make many people wary. That afternoon, as I was reviewing contracts, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it. "Eleanor." It was Michael's voice, sharp and pointed. I was silent for a moment before replying. "Yes. So you're working again, I hear." Though he couldn't see it, I smiled. "A girl's got to eat." He snorted. "Where are you working? Some small-time firm?" "Something like that," I answered briefly. "Is everything okay?" The question sounded like concern, but I knew it was a probe. "Yes, I'm fine. Why did you call?" "Just to ask that." There was a few seconds of silence on the other end. "Eleanor," his voice lowered. "The Meadowlands project. You don't have anything to do with that, do you?" My heart gave a single, hard beat, but I didn't let it show. What could I possibly have to do with it? I laughed lightly. I'm just worried about paying my rent right now. Michael hung up without another word. I put the phone down and stared at my laptop screen. He was starting to smell something amiss. Good. But it wasn't enough yet. 2 days later, I completed my internal report for Arthur Vance. I clearly laid out each risk and added my recommendation. If our fund puts our investment on hold, other funds are likely to follow suit. If the flow of capital stalls, Michael's company will face a liquidity squeeze. Mr. Vance showed no particular emotion after reading the entire report. You're aware that if this report gets out, a lot of people will be unhappy. I'm aware. Why are you so interested in this project? I looked him straight in the eye. I don't like seeing cracks covered up with a thin sheet of glass. He watched me for a longer moment. Perhaps he understood that the answer went beyond just financial concerns. Over the weekend, the fund internally announced that it was temporarily putting the disbursement for the Meadowlands project on hold for further review. The news spread quickly through the industry, and several other funds began to adopt a more cautious stance. That night, a message came from Sarah. Michael was furious in a meeting. He said someone was sabotaging him behind the scenes. I was sitting on the metal bed. The yellow light illuminated the stained wall. I imagined his face when he was angry, the furrowed brow, the hand slamming on the desk. I had seen him angry many times over the past 8 years, but this was different. This time, he didn't know who was cornering him. My phone rang again. A text from an unknown number. What are you doing right now? I didn't reply. Another message came. You think I won't find out? I smiled. A predator sending messages in the middle of the night is a sign that he's losing his composure. I turned off the light, lay down, and stared at the dark ceiling. I wasn't satisfied. I just felt that everything was moving into its proper orbit. The next morning, I went to the market as usual and bought cheap vegetables on sale. I haggled over a few dollars as usual. The person watching me was still there. They had no idea that this mundane morning routine was just the surface of a crack that was continuing to spread. On Sunday afternoon, Arthur Vance called me in for a private meeting. Not in the large conference room, but in his personal office. Do you understand you're taking on a very confident man right now? He asked, as I sat down. I am aware. Confidence sometimes comes with recklessness. And recklessness comes with collapse. He nodded. His gaze grew sharper. You're not just trying to protect our fund, are you? I was silent for a moment, then answered honestly. I'm hoping to prevent more victims of that recklessness. He didn't ask anything further. We will continue to hold on this project, he said. Keep up the good work. As I left the 32nd floor, I knew I had taken another step. The first crack was already visible. With just a little more pressure, that glass would shatter. That night, I stood at the door of my apartment and looked up at the night sky. Michael said he wanted to see how I would survive without money. I was going to show him. But what he was about to see wasn't my poverty, but the cracks spreading throughout the empire he had built. I could feel the change in the air from the beginning of the week. On the 32nd floor, meetings grew longer, and emails flew more frequently. And outside, in Michael's world, the signs of trouble were no longer just whispers. On Monday morning, just as I got to the office, the internal line rang. Eleanor, my office. Mr. Vance's voice was brief. I entered his office. The glass door closed, creating a near-perfect soundproof seal. He placed a stack of documents in front of me. Their company's cash flow is starting to tighten, he said. I didn't need him to say the name, I knew it was Michael's firm. 2 of their main banks have requested additional collateral. I flipped through the pages quickly. The numbers didn't lie. When Arthur Vance's fund put their disbursement on hold, other funds had followed. The promised capital was frozen, but the costs for site preparation and legal consultations continued to mount. Some partner companies began demanding payment earlier than scheduled. Can they raise the funds? I asked. Mr. Vance leaned back in his chair. It's possible, if they get an additional infusion from their foreign partners. But what if those partners are also feeling the pressure? He left the sentence unfinished. I understood. A liquidity squeeze is like a small crack in a wall. At first, no one pays it any mind, but as water seeps in over time, the entire wall can come crashing down. That night, a message came from Sarah. Michael is scrambling to raise money. He was saying that if he can just get through this month, everything will be fine. I stared at the screen. My heart didn't waver. Michael was good at moving money around. He had the connections, the reputation, and the confidence to make a lot of people believe him. But a reputation is like a stock. Once trust begins to erode, its value can fall faster than you'd think. 2 days later, a major business journal published a cautious analysis of the Meadowlands project. It emphasized the need for legal transparency. There were no accusations, no conclusions. It just asked questions. But sometimes, a question is more dangerous than an accusation. In the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Michael. I answered. "What is it?" His voice lacked its usual swagger. "Eleanor, where are you working now?" "I told you. A small firm." "A small firm that has access to major investment funds?" I paused for a moment. "Do you think I have that kind of power?" He let out a harsh breath on the other end. "You're trying to ruin me." "I'm just worried about my rent," I replied lightly. "How could I possibly ruin you?" The line was silent for a few seconds. Then his voice dropped. "If you need money, I can give you some." I cut him off. "I don't need it." I could hear him grit his teeth. "Eleanor, don't be foolish." "I'm not being foolish," I said slowly. "I'm just living." I hung up before he could say another word. My hands weren't shaking. I felt no satisfaction, no pity. It just felt like the gears were turning in their proper tracks. That weekend, I was asked to attend a private meeting with 2 banking officials. The topic was re-evaluating the risk level of some industrial park real estate projects in the region. Michael's company name came up several times. One of the bank executives said bluntly, "We don't want to cut off their funding. But if their cash flow doesn't recover in a timely manner, we'll be forced to take measures." I just listened. I didn't interject. I understood the mechanism. When banks lose confidence, they don't need to make a scene. They just change the terms of the contract. And the new terms can suffocate any company that is short on cash. In the evening, I returned to my apartment as usual. I turned on the groaning fan and washed some vegetables in a small plastic tub. The person watching me was still there, but I knew they had heard the rumors too. They must have known their employer was in trouble. I opened the flip phone. Phase 2, sufficient pressure achieved. Prepare contingency plan. A reply came back. Contact made with independent legal team. Ready to release documents on associated companies if necessary. I didn't reply immediately. I stared at my reflection in the dark window. Releasing the documents meant accelerating things. But I didn't want a collapse that was too sudden. I wanted Michael to still be confident that he could raise the funds. Because when a man has hope, he will pour more money into a deeper hole. The next morning, Michael contacted me directly. He suggested we meet at a quiet cafe in Soho. I arrived on time. Michael was already there. He looked a bit thinner, with faint dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze was still sharp. "You look well," he said, forcing a casual tone. "I'm breathing." He snorted. "Eleanor, what do you want?" "I don't want anything from you." "Cut the crap," he said, leaning forward. "If you're behind this, stop it. I'll give you enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life." I looked down at the cup of black coffee in front of me, then raised my head. "You told me I was nothing without you." He flinched. "I'm living without you," I continued. "Isn't that enough?" The air between us grew taut, like a guitar string. "You think you can win against me?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm not playing a game of winning or losing," I replied. "I just don't want to be a chess piece anymore." He was silent. For the first time, I saw in his eyes not contempt, but a flicker of genuine unease. "I'll get through this," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "I wish you luck." I stood up first. As I left the cafe, I didn't look back. That night, messages from Sarah came in one after another. "Michael is selling some of his shares to raise capital. The foreign partners are demanding a review of the contract." I sat on the bed and took a slow breath. The liquidity squeeze was starting to tighten around him. I knew this was just the beginning of the storm. And when the real storm hit, it would no longer be cautious articles or private meetings. It would be red numbers, relentless phone calls, and sleepless nights. I put my phone down and stared at the stained ceiling. Michael had wanted to see me on my knees, begging. Now, I didn't want him on his knees. I just wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose control. The official news broke on a Tuesday morning. It was no longer a cautious analysis or an anonymous comment. It was a brief notice from the largest commercial bank financing the Meadowlands project. They had formally requested that Michael's company provide additional collateral within 10 business days, or they would adjust his line of credit. The news only took up a small corner of the business section, but among investors, it was like the clang of a metal bell in a silent room. I sat in my 100-square-foot apartment, reading the news on my phone. Beside me, water was boiling in a small pot. I didn't smile. I just put the phone down, lifted the lid, and added a pinch of salt to the water. My facade had to remain this simple. In the morning, I walked to the corner of the street as usual, and bought a $3 breakfast burrito. I took my change, nodded, and said thank you. The man on the gray motorcycle was still parked a few dozen feet away. He was still pretending to look at his phone. I knew he had read this morning's news. I also knew that somewhere, Michael was starting to receive unpleasant phone calls. The atmosphere on the 32nd floor was completely different. It was no longer cautious vigilance, but confident movement. Arthur Vance called an emergency meeting with the analysis team. The bank has made its move, he said briefly. We will maintain our decision to hold the fund disbursement. One of the team members asked, what if they provide the additional collateral? I stepped forward. That's a possibility. But doing so will increase their cost of capital, and an increased cost of capital will put even more pressure on their profitability. Mr. Vance looked at me. What do you predict their next move will be? I answered without hesitation. They will either sell more shares or secure high-interest, short-term financing. And if they choose the latter, the interest payments will eat into their profits before the project even becomes operational. The room was silent for a few seconds. No one argued. That afternoon, Sarah sent me a stream of messages. Michael just held a shareholder meeting. He declared that everything is under control. He's meeting with a group of private investors tonight. I read the messages and assembled the pieces in my head. Michael was not a man who showed panic in public. He would maintain his confident image until the very last moment. But I knew him. When cornered, he was more likely to accelerate than to retreat. That night, my phone rang. Michael's number appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. Eleanor. His voice wasn't as sharp as before, but I could tell he was trying to maintain control. Did you see the news this morning? I saw it in the paper. It's nothing, he said quickly. Just a procedural issue. I remained silent. You don't believe me, do you? He asked. It's not my place to believe or not believe, I replied calmly. I'm just a person worrying about her rent. He let out a harsh breath. Eleanor, if you want to come back, I can make a place for you. I paused for a moment. Come back, and do what? At least you wouldn't have to live like this. I looked around the small room, at the damp walls, the groaning fan. This is enough for me, I said slowly. And I don't want to come back. The line was silent for a few seconds. You've changed, he said. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe I'm just not afraid anymore. I hung up before the conversation could venture into unnecessary emotional territory. 2 days later, a second piece of news broke. A major private investor announced they were pulling out of the Meadowlands project, citing a portfolio restructuring. The market took it as a sign of lost confidence. In the private stock market, the value of Michael's company began to fall. On the 32nd floor, we received an updated report. Arthur Vance didn't say much. He just asked me one question. How long do you think they can hold on? I looked at the cash flow chart and said, if they don't find a new source of funding within 2 weeks, they will have to start selling assets. He nodded. It seems we won't have to push them any further. I understood his meaning. The natural pressure was already enough. That night, I didn't go straight back to my apartment. I walked along the path by the East River. The yellow streetlights reflected on the calm water. The wind gently brushed through my hair. I remembered my 8 years of marriage, the moments I stood behind Michael at contract signing ceremonies, listening to him talk about strategy and ambition. I had believed he was strong. I thought his confidence was a safe place. But now, I realized it was also his greatest weakness. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Are you happy now? I didn't reply. A second message came. Don't push me. I turned off the screen. An arrogant man sending threatening messages at night was proof that he had felt the first wound. The next morning, I woke up early as usual and went to the market with my grocery bag. The person watching me was still there, but his gaze was no longer indifferent. Perhaps he was worried about his own paycheck. At the office, I received an email from the independent legal team. They had confirmed another crucial fact. An affiliated company had used a single collateral asset to secure 2 different loans. If this information were to be made public, the parent company's creditworthiness would take a serious hit. I read the email and took a deep breath. This was a sharp knife, but I didn't want to use it yet. If the banks tightened the screws a little more, everything would come to light on its own. In the afternoon, I was surprised to get another request to meet from Michael. Not at a cafe this time, but at his office. I knew this was a reckless move, but I agreed. When I entered the familiar office, the smell of wood and cologne was the same. Michael was standing with his back to the window. "You came," he said without turning around. "I don't have much time," I replied. He turned. His gaze was no longer absolutely sharp. "Eleanor, stop this." "Stop what?" He stepped closer. "You know what I'm talking about." I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not doing anything." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "You think I don't know? I was just standing behind you," I said slowly. "I know where you are strong, and where you are weak." The air between us grew heavy. "You want to see me fail?" he asked. "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose control," I replied. He was silent. For the first time, I saw in his eyes not confidence, but the shadow of real fear. "I will get through this," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "I don't doubt your abilities," I said. "But this time, you're not the only one controlling the board." I turned and left his office, without waiting for a response. As the elevator doors closed, I stared at my reflection in the metal walls. I didn't see a discarded woman. I saw a person who had walked out of the darkness on her own. The first wound had been inflicted. And I knew the next one would not be shallow. After the meeting in Michael's office, one thing became clear. He no longer saw me as a pathetic ex-wife or a chess piece that could be won over with a bit of money or a proposition. He had started to see me as an official threat. That day, his eyes held not just anger, but also caution. And when a man accustomed to control becomes cautious, he chooses one of two paths: retreat, or attack with greater force. I knew Michael would not retreat. 2 days later, the first piece of information about his counterattack arrived. Sarah sent a message late at night. "Michael is spreading rumors in the industry. He's saying that speculators are deliberately manipulating the media to devalue the project. Your name hasn't come up, but he's looking for the mastermind." I read the message in the dark room, my only light coming from the sliver of a streetlight through the window. I wasn't surprised. When people can't find a specific target, they create an imaginary enemy. But I knew that if he caught even the slightest scent of a trail, he would follow it to the end. The next morning when I arrived on the 32nd floor, Arthur Vance already knew about the rumors. "There's some chatter," he said briefly as I sat down in front of him. "Your name hasn't been mentioned, but there's talk of someone with intimate knowledge of the company's internal structure being involved." I looked at him. "Are you suspecting me?" Mr. Vance met my gaze directly. "I'm only interested in the data." He placed his hand on a stack of documents. "And the data tells me you weren't wrong." I gave a small nod. That was what I needed, not blind faith, but trust based on the value I had produced. But at the same time, I understood that the game was changing. If Michael felt cornered, he might use pieces I hadn't anticipated. That afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was more shaken than usual. "Eleanor, people from his family came by just now." I shot up from my chair. "Did they do anything?" "They said you're deliberately trying to ruin Michael's business. They said if you don't stop, they'll sue you." I gripped the phone tightly. "You didn't sign anything, did you?" "No," her voice was hoarse. "But it was scary." I closed my eyes for a moment. This was what I had expected. When he couldn't get to me directly, he would try to get to my family. "Mom, listen to me," I said, each word slow and clear. "No one can sue you for this. If they come back, call the local police precinct. Don't talk to them anymore." My mother was silent for a few seconds. "What kind of trouble are you in, Eleanor?" "I'm just protecting myself." I hung up. My heart was still beating fast. I was prepared for a head-on confrontation in the business world. But when family was involved, it wasn't as easy to control my emotions. That night, I sent a message on the flip phone. "Activate Family Protection Plan. Intensify internal media monitoring." No public response. The reply was swift. "Understood." 2 days later, the real tipping point came. A second bank notified Michael's company that they were adjusting their line of credit. It wasn't a complete cutoff, but it was enough to trigger a domino effect. Partner companies began demanding upfront payments. Rumors circulated that several of his company's executives were already sending out their resumes. On the 32nd floor, we received continuous updates. Arthur Vance called a brief meeting. "This is the crucial phase," he said. "If they can't raise capital within 10 days, they'll be forced to sell major assets." I looked at the cash flow chart. The red line was getting thicker. "He won't sell easily," I said. "He'll try to protect his image until the very last moment." Mr. Vance looked at me. "You still think you're outside of this game?" I knew the question wasn't an accusation. It was a reminder that I was too deeply involved to pretend to be an outsider anymore. Late in the afternoon, I got a call from Michael. This time, his voice could no longer maintain its control. "Eleanor, what the hell do you want?" "I don't want anything." "Don't lie," he growled. "The second bank just squeezed our funding." "You think that's a coincidence?" I was silent for a moment. "You said I was nothing without you," I replied. "Now you think I have the power to move all of this?" He took a harsh breath on the other end. "You're getting revenge." "I'm just not helping you," I said lightly. "That's a different thing." A few seconds of silence passed. "Eleanor," his voice dropped. "I could lose everything." "I know the feeling," I replied. "You already gave it to me." I hung up. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was from the realization that I had already crossed a line. This was no longer a game of adjusting speed. This was the moment he truly felt the crisis. That night, I didn't go straight back to the apartment. I sat on a bench by the East River, watching the cars go by. I remembered the days I used to wait for him to come home late, the days I stayed silent when he ignored me in public, the past when I believed patience was the way to protect my family. I didn't regret loving him. But I was no longer willing to live in that shadow. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Michael just held an emergency meeting. He's decided to put up some of his personal assets as additional collateral." I stared at the screen. My heart beat slowly. This was the tipping point. When a man starts using personal assets to save a corporation, it's proof that he's putting nearly everything he has on the line. I replied with just 2 words. "Stay silent." The next morning, the market reacted faster than I had thought. Rumors of the personal asset collateral spread. No one confirmed it, but it was enough to keep pushing the company's stock price down. On the 32nd floor, Arthur Vance received the report and looked at me. "Any regrets?" he asked. I looked out the glass window at the city spreading out under the sun. "I didn't push him," I said. "I just didn't catch him." He said nothing more. That night, when I returned to my apartment, the gray motorcycle was gone from its usual spot. I paused for a few seconds. They had either pulled their personnel, or changed their surveillance methods. I opened the door and entered the familiar small space. I sat on the metal bed and stared at the stained ceiling. The tipping point had arrived. But I knew a building doesn't collapse from a single crack. It needed more force, more time, more pressure from different directions. And I knew that every step I took from now on would be more dangerous. The disappearance of the gray motorcycle from the alley was not a coincidence. That morning, when I went to buy my usual breakfast burrito, I paused for a moment. The man in the helmet was gone, as was the prying gaze hidden behind a phone screen. The alley was as noisy as ever with the sound of delivery bikes, but I knew one thing. Michael had withdrawn his surveillance. Either he no longer had the resources to spare for me, or he was focusing all his energy elsewhere. Either possibility was to my advantage. The air on the 32nd floor was heavier than ever. The internal update at 8 a.m. confirmed a significant event. The foreign partner firm in the Meadowlands project had sent an official letter stating they would conduct a full review of all partnership terms before their next fund transfer. The reason they gave was a very polite one, ensuring transparency and investment security, but everyone in the financial world knew it was a sign of doubt. Arthur Vance called me into his personal office. "The foreign partners have slowed down," he said briefly. "This is the first domino." I looked at the stack of documents on his desk. "If they pull out completely, the project will fall into a serious funding crisis." He nodded. "And if the project's funding dries up, the banks will have a perfect reason to apply more pressure." We looked at each other for a few seconds. Without needing to say more, we both knew the chain reaction had begun. During my lunch break, messages from Sarah came in one after another. Michael just had a video conference with the foreign partners and he was furious. Apparently, they demanded more transparent information about the intermediary companies. I read the message and quickly assembled the pieces in my head. The intermediary companies. That was the biggest weakness. I hadn't detonated that information yet. But if a bank or another investor dug a little deeper, it would inevitably come to light. That same afternoon, a business news site published an article about the possibility of a liquidity crisis in some industrial park projects in the region. No specific names were mentioned, but no one in the market was confused about who the target was. The market reacted faster than expected. The stock price of Michael's company continued to fall. This time, it wasn't a gradual decline, it was a clear, steep drop. That night, my phone rang incessantly. It was Michael. I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Eleanor," his voice was hoarser than before. "What are you doing right now?" "I just got off work." Did you see it? He asked, his voice as taut as a guitar string. The stock price crashed. I saw it in the news, I replied. Are you happy now? I was silent for a few seconds. I never set out to make you happy or disappointed. He took a harsh breath. Eleanor, I could lose everything. I lost everything too, I said slowly. The only difference is, I had no one to beg. The line went silent. I heard him take a deep breath. He continued. If you're involved in this, stop it. I'll solve your family's problems. I'll pay off your parents' debt. I laughed faintly. You think money can buy my silence? It's because you're angry right now. I'm not angry, I replied. I'm just not afraid anymore. I hung up. For the first time since the divorce, I heard a distinct crack in his voice. It wasn't a threat or a proposition. It was the last gasp of a man trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. The next morning, official news broke that the foreign partner firm was temporarily suspending fund transfers until an independent review was complete. This meant the project's cash flow was almost completely cut off. A third bank announced it was reevaluating its entire credit limit. On the 32nd floor, Arthur Vance stared at the bright red graph on the screen. A chain reaction, he said. Faster than I thought. I looked down at my hands. I felt no joy. I just felt that everything was proceeding according to market logic. When trust is lost, no one wants to be the last one holding the stock. Late in the afternoon, my mother called. Eleanor, people from his family came again. Her voice trembled. They said the company is in big trouble because of you. I gripped the phone tightly. Mom, listen to me. I said slowly. No one can legally blame me for this. Don't be afraid. But they said if the company goes under, our family won't be spared either. I took a deep breath. That's just them trying to worry you and put pressure on me. Trust me. My mother was silent for a few seconds. I trust you. I hung up. My heart was heavier than ever. I knew that the more desperate the situation became, the more Michael would resort to psychological pressure. But this time, I wasn't alone. That night, I sent a message on the flip phone. Prepare plan to release information on intermediary companies if necessary. Execution still on hold. The reply came back. Ready. I stood by the apartment window, staring at the distant lights. I remembered the days I used to stand by the window of our old penthouse, waiting for Michael to come back from meetings. Back then, I believed his success was the family's success. I never dreamed that one day I would be the one to witness that very success begin to crumble. The next morning, the real fall began. A major shareholder sold their entire stake in Michael's company. The information spread like wildfire, and the stock price went into a freefall. Financial forums began to openly mention the Meadowlands project by name. My phone rang. It wasn't Michael, it was Arthur Vance. Come up to my office. I entered his office. He was standing in front of the window. This is the decisive moment, he said. If the information about the intermediary companies comes out, it will be the final blow. I looked at him. What do you want me to do? I want you to consider, he replied. A building with a weakened foundation will collapse on its own. I was silent. I knew he wasn't talking about profits. He was asking me whether I was willing to cross the line. That night, Michael called again. This time, he didn't beat around the bush. Eleanor, I want to talk in person. We have nothing more to talk about. You're cornering me, his voice was hoarse. You want to see me go bankrupt? I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I want you to understand that no one is above the laws of the market. You think this is fair? I'm just not helping you, I said again. That's a different thing. The other end of the line went silent. The chain reaction had already started. And I knew that even if I didn't push any further, the game had already entered an irreversible stage. That morning, the sky over New York was gray, as if the city were holding its breath before a great storm. The moment I entered the 32nd floor, I felt a different kind of velocity. No one was speaking loudly, but the phones were ringing off the hook, and update emails were flooding in. The market status board on the large screen outside the common space was flashing a familiar red. Michael's company stock was in a freefall. It was no longer a normal fluctuation, it was an unstoppable crash. I sat at my desk and opened the latest update report. A single sentence caught my eye: a formal request for loan restructuring was required within 7 days. In finance, 7 days can be the line between life and death. Arthur Vance came out of a conference room. His gaze was calm but more intense than usual. Eleanor, he called out in a low voice. I stood up and followed him into his office. The foreign partners have pulled out completely, he said. It's no longer a review. I nodded. So, their cash flow is effectively frozen. He looked at me. What do you predict he will do next? I took a deep breath. He will either look for a last-minute strategic investor or sell a major asset at a steep discount. And if no one buys, I said slowly, the building will collapse on its own. The air in the office was as heavy as lead. This was no longer about strategy. This was about survival. That afternoon, Sarah called instead of texting. Her voice was frantic. Eleanor, things are really serious. Michael was just publicly condemned by his shareholders. There are even demands for him to step down as CEO. I was silent for a few seconds. How did he react? He said everything is under control. Sarah sighed. But from what I could see, his face didn't have that same confidence anymore. I hung up and placed my hands on my desk. I remembered his gaze at those glamorous parties, a wine glass in hand, speaking as if he held the future in his palm. I used to believe in that gaze. Now I understood it was just a glittering glass mask hiding his inner recklessness. That night, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared. I stared at it longer than usual before answering. Eleanor, his voice was hoarse and devoid of any tension. Will you meet me? I think we've said all there is to say. No, we haven't, he said, his voice urgent. We have to talk in person. I was silent for a moment. Where? At that cafe we used to go to. I agreed. The cafe wasn't crowded. The rich smell of coffee mixed with soft music. Michael was sitting in a corner booth. He was no longer in his impeccably tailored suit. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his tie was loosened. He looked up as I approached. His eyes were deeply tired. You came, he said quietly. I sat across from him. You have something to say. He looked at me for a few seconds, as if weighing pride against reality. I need more time. Time for what? Time to raise the funds. If this project collapses, I lose everything. I looked him straight in the eye. You told me I was nothing without you. He closed his eyes for a moment. I was wrong. I said nothing. Eleanor, his voice dropped. Can you talk to that fund, ask them to back off? I let out a faint laugh. You think I have that kind of authority? I know you have influence. I shook my head. You're overestimating me more than you ever have. He looked down, gripping his coffee cup with both hands. Please. That one word fell onto the table like a heavy object. I looked at him. For the first time in all these years, I heard the word, please, come from Michael's mouth. Please. Don't push me any further. I took a deep breath. I'm not pushing you, I said clearly. The situation is pushing you. Forget the logic, he said, looking up. His eyes were red. You know that if the company goes bankrupt, I'm not the only one who gets hurt. I know, I replied. But you also knew all of these risks from the beginning. He fell silent. I was behind you, I continued. I saw you sign contracts on shaky legal ground. I heard you say you'd deal with the risks later. Well, later has arrived. He let out a harsh breath. You think I'm going to get on my knees? I don't want you on your knees, I said. I just want you to understand what it feels like to be cornered. A heavy silence fell between us. I could hear the distinct sound of a spoon clinking against a cup at the next table. Eleanor, he said, his voice even quieter. Even if I go bankrupt, you get nothing back. I looked at him for a long time. I've already lost enough, I replied. I don't need anything more from you. He leaned back in his chair. His gaze was the emptiest I had ever seen. So this is really the end. I stood up. No, I said. It's just time for you to take responsibility for yourself. I left the cafe and stepped out onto the street. A light rain had begun to fall. I didn't open my umbrella. The cold droplets on my face made me feel more clear-headed than ever. That night, the news came in one after another. A major contractor announced they were halting cooperation until payment was received, and the stock price fell again. Rumors flew that calls from creditors were flooding in. I sat in my apartment, listening to the rain on the tin roof. I didn't feel happy. I just felt that a chapter was closing. My phone buzzed again. A text from Michael. I'm really begging you. I stared at the words for a long time. It was the first plea. But I knew the storm had not yet passed. The morning after, I woke up earlier than usual. The rain had stopped, and the air was damp and heavy. I stood in front of the small mirror in my apartment and looked at my face. The weary look I had deliberately crafted for weeks was gone. I tied my hair back neatly and chose a white blouse and black slacks. Today was not a day for playing poor. It was the day everything would be laid bare. When I entered the 32nd floor, the atmosphere was completely different. Arthur Vance had been there since early morning. On his desk was a thick file containing all the legal documents related to Michael's intermediary companies. "Are you ready?" he asked. I took a deep breath as I looked at the stack of documents. "If we release this, there's no going back." He nodded. "The market needs transparency. This is no longer a personal matter." The internal meeting was swift. The legal team confirmed that all the materials had been verified through independent sources and that there was no fabricated information. No fabrications, no incitement. Just the truth, rearranged in a clear order. "If this information gets out, the pressure will double," one team member said. I replied, "The pressure already existed. Today, that pressure just gets a name." At 10 a.m., a press release was sent to several major financial news outlets. It wasn't aggressive or sensational. It just listed the facts, double-pledged assets, potential risks, and the possible impact on their ability to pay. The market reacted. The stock price of Michael's company went into a vertical dive. The phones in the office rang off the hook. The red numbers on the large screen traced a steep cliff that went on and on. Mr. Vance looked at me. "This is the final blow." I said nothing. I just watched the chart like an EKG slowly flatlining. That same afternoon, the news spread widely. Banks universally demanded a reevaluation of collateral assets. Some creditors demanded immediate repayment. The already depleted cash flow was now almost completely choked off. Sarah called. Her voice was frantic. "Eleanor, it's chaos at Michael's company. There are rumors he's been asked to resign." I closed my eyes for a moment. How did he react? He's been in closed-door meetings all morning. I heard the banks demanded to meet with him directly. I put the phone down. The image of the arrogant man in my mind was gone. All that was left was the image of a person desperately trying to hold on to the last few pieces. At 3 p.m., my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen. I knew this call would be different from all the others. I answered. "Eleanor," his voice was hoarse. "You did this." I didn't deny it. I just released the truth. "You knew what the result would be." "I knew." He let out a harsh breath. "The bank just gave me notice. If I can't cover the collateral in 3 days, they'll initiate loan recovery." I was silent. "Eleanor," his voice sank. "I'm actually begging you now." I heard the word begging clearly. It was no longer a mumble in a cafe. It was an official surrender. "Can you tell them to give me a little more time?" "I can't control them," I said slowly. "You should have controlled yourself." I was wrong. His voice cracked. I was too confident. I looked out the office window at the city, which was moving on as usual. "You said you wanted to see how I would survive with nothing," I reminded him. "Now you know how it feels." Only a shallow breath came from the other end. "Eleanor, I can't take it." I closed my eyes. A part of me remembered the early days of our marriage when we talked about the future together. But that memory was not enough to change the present. "I didn't bankrupt you," I said clearly. "You chose this path yourself." I hung up. In the evening, the bank's official notice was made public. If a plan for additional collateral was not presented within 3 days, the loan would be converted to a bad debt and processed according to the contract. It was practically a death sentence. I sat in my small apartment, watching my phone screen light up incessantly. News, comments, analysis, the name Michael Callahan filled the financial forums. My mother called. "Eleanor, it's gotten really bad, hasn't it? Are you okay?" I laughed lightly. "I'm fine." My mother was silent for a few seconds before saying quietly, "I don't blame you, honey." I gripped the phone tightly. I just wanted us to not have to be afraid anymore. I hung up and stared at the ceiling. The day of revelation was over. The game was no longer hidden. Somewhere in this city, Michael was sitting amidst ringing phones, payment demands, and suspicious gazes. And I was sitting in a 100-square-foot room, listening to the sound of a groaning fan. I no longer needed to play poor, but I decided to stay here until everything was truly over. The day of revelation had passed, and from now on, everything would manifest not as psychological pressure, but as real consequences. The 3 days given by the bank were like a countdown clock hanging over Michael's head. Even though it was invisible, everyone could feel its heavy, ticking sound. Time waited for no one. The 3 days were not a time for rescue, but a time to confirm what was about to happen. On the morning of the first of those 3 days, I entered the 32nd floor with a completely different mindset. I was no longer walking on eggshells or waiting for reactions. The board had already been upended, and I was just watching to see which piece would fall first. Arthur Vance was in the conference room. The screen displayed the latest status of Michael's company's cash flow. "They're trying to sell a spare plot of land they own in Jersey," he said. "But the asking price is almost 10% below market value." I looked at the chart and said, "When you're desperate for cash, you can't negotiate on price." He nodded. "But the buyers also know they're desperate." That meant that even if they sold the land, the money would be far from enough to fill the liquidity hole. During my lunch break, Sarah sent a message. "Michael is running around all over the city. He met with 2 major investors this morning. Is there any hope?" I asked back. "I heard they demanded a change in management as a condition for investing." I took a slow breath. A change in management. That meant Michael would lose control of the company that was practically his child. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Michael. I knew this call would be different. I answered. "Eleanor," his voice was visibly exhausted. "I sold almost all of my personal assets." I was silent. "But it's still not enough." "I told you," I replied lightly. "This pressure isn't something I created." "Don't give me that," he cut me off. "I know I was wrong. I know I was overconfident. But I don't understand. If they collect on the debt, it's not just me who gets ruined. Hundreds of employees will lose their jobs." Those words resonated with me. I had considered this. I didn't want innocent people to become casualties. "Do you have a restructuring plan?" I asked bluntly. "I do," he said quickly. "But I need more time." "Time isn't something you get with promises," I replied. "You have to prove it's possible." The other end of the line went silent. "Can you tell them that I have a clear plan?" I took a deep breath. "I can't vouch for a plan I haven't even seen." "I'll send you the proposal," he said hurriedly. "Just take a look at it." I agreed. Not because I wanted to help him, but because I wanted to know if he had truly learned anything from this crisis. That night, I received an email. It was a roughly 30-page restructuring plan. I read it line by line in my quiet apartment. The plan included cost-cutting measures, the sale of non-core assets, and the appointment of an independent executive by the board. It wasn't a perfect plan, but at least it wasn't empty words anymore. On the morning of the second day, I brought the plan to Arthur Vance. "He submitted a plan," I said. He looked it over. "It's desperate," he assessed. "But not without potential." I looked at him. "If there's a clear roadmap, is there a chance the banks might give him a little more time?" He was silent for a few seconds. "There's a chance. But they will demand very strict oversight." "That's the price he has to pay," I replied. That same afternoon, news spread that Michael's company was in negotiations with a new investment group, conditional on a change in the management structure. The stock price stopped falling but didn't rise. The market started to wait. That night, Michael called again. "Eleanor," his voice wasn't as frantic as before. "I know you saw the plan." "I did. What do you think?" "I think you finally understood that you can't control everything on your own." He let out a faint sigh. "I've lost so much." "So did I said. "The difference is, I learned from what I lost." The other end of the line went silent again. "I'll accept the management change," he said slowly. "I don't have a choice anymore." The third day came sooner than I thought. The main bank officially announced that they would consider an extension if the company submitted a debt restructuring plan involving new investors and an independent board member. It wasn't a rescue, but it was a narrow opening. On the 32nd floor, Arthur Vance looked at me. "Do you want us to support the extension?" I looked out the glass window at the city under a new sun. "If the plan is strictly supervised and completely transparent, I think they should be given a chance." He nodded. "Because this is no longer a personal matter." I smiled faintly. "Yes. Exactly." That afternoon, Michael sent me a short text. "The bank has agreed to consider an extension." I read the message. My heart wasn't as heavy as before. Not because he was completely out of the crisis, but because he had to pay the price with his control and reputation. The final 3 days ended not with a complete collapse, but with a slim chance. But that chance was no longer about arrogance. It was about responsibility. I sat in my small apartment, listening to the regular whir of the fan. I knew that from now on, the story would move in a different direction. It was no longer a war of pressure, but a question of how people stand up again after hitting rock bottom. The 3-day storm ended not with a bang of total collapse, but with a narrow door left ajar, just enough for air to pass through. Michael's company didn't go bankrupt immediately, but it was no longer the confident empire it once was. The market had seen the cracks, the banks had attached conditions, and the new investors demanded a complete overhaul. From now on, his every move would be monitored. That morning, I went to work on the 32nd floor with a strange feeling. There was no sense of victory, no relief. Just the quietness after a storm has passed. Arthur Vance was looking at an updated report when I entered his office. The banks have agreed to a 30-day extension, he said. But on the condition that an independent board member is appointed by the end of this week. I nodded. He will have to give up his managerial control. He looked at me. Do you think he can accept that? I think he no longer has a choice, I replied. There was no color in my words. It was reality. When people hit rock bottom, they either give up or accept change. That same afternoon, official news was released that an interim CEO from outside the company had been appointed. The market reacted cautiously. The stock price stopped falling and fluctuated slightly. No one was certain, but at least the speed of the crash had slowed. In the evening, Sarah called. He seems so different, she said quietly. How so? I've never seen him so quiet. I looked up at the ceiling of my apartment. The old water stains were gradually drying. Maybe he's learning to listen, I replied. Or maybe he's just tired. Sarah sighed. Eleanor, are you okay? I'm okay, I said honestly. And for the first time since everything began, I realized I was no longer swayed by his every fluctuation. My heart no longer raced every time I heard bad news, and I no longer stayed up all night waiting for updates. I had played my part. The rest was his responsibility. 2 days later, I received an email from Michael. Not a call or a short text, but a long email. He wrote that he had co-signed the restructuring plan, accepted the reduction of his control, and agreed to an independent oversight committee monitoring all cash flow. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't mention my name. He just wrote one sentence at the end. Now I know what it means to lose control. I read the email in my office, amidst the white lights and the regular sound of keyboards. I didn't reply immediately. I just left it there, like a confession that came too late. In the afternoon, Arthur Vance called me into his office. Do you want to continue monitoring this project? He asked. I think my role here is over, I replied. He looked at me searchingly. You don't want to see it through to the end? I've seen enough, I said slowly. The rest is a process of recovery, not collapse. He gave a small nod. You've grown. I smiled. Maybe I'm just not in the dark anymore. That night, I went back to my apartment earlier than usual. The familiar alley was as bustling as ever. The sound of children playing, the revving of a motorcycle engine, the smell of cooking wafting from a small diner. I stood in front of my door and looked around one last time. This place had once been the stage for my performance of poverty. Now it was just a temporary shelter. I sat on the metal bed and opened my old suitcase. Inside were still just a few simple clothes, but I knew my life no longer fit inside that suitcase. My phone rang. It was Michael. I answered. Eleanor, his voice was low and no longer tense. I just finished signing. I know. I'd like to see you once. I was silent for a few seconds. Why? I want to thank you. I frowned slightly. Thank me for what? For not pushing me all the way to the end. I let out a light breath. I didn't help you. I know, he replied. But you could have chosen another way. I looked out the window. The yellow streetlight cast a long shadow on the wall. What did you learn? I asked. A few seconds of silence. That money doesn't always solve everything, he said slowly. And that not everyone needs me. I didn't reply immediately. Then that's enough, I said finally. We didn't meet. We didn't need to. That conversation was enough to close a chapter. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. I went out onto the 32nd floor balcony and looked down at the streets of the financial district. The city was as bustling as ever. No one knew that an empire had just crumbled. No one knew that a woman who had been considered a nobody was behind its movements. But that no longer mattered. I realized I no longer wanted to define myself through someone else's collapse. I wanted to define myself through the path ahead of me. That night, I packed up my apartment room. I folded the thin blanket, took down the hangers, and wiped the plastic desk clean. Seeing the room gradually empty, my heart felt lighter than I had expected. It wasn't just Michael who had changed after hitting rock bottom. I had changed too. I left that apartment on a sunny morning. There were no tears, no dramatic scenes. I just pulled my old suitcase, walked out of the alley, and paused for a moment to look around one last time. This was the stage of my performance, the place where I had read reports through the night and listened to my own sighs as the pressure mounted. But now, it was just a station I had passed through. I didn't go back to the old penthouse. I didn't look for a luxurious place. I chose a small, sunny, and quiet apartment near the city center. Not to prove anything, but to remind myself that I could choose where I lived. My role on the 32nd floor also changed. The Meadowlands project was no longer the center of my daily life. The board was in place, the cash flow was strictly supervised, and the market, though not as hot as before, was gradually stabilizing. One afternoon, Arthur Vance called me into his office. "You've accomplished a great deal," he said. "I don't see it as a victory," I replied. "Exactly," he nodded. "It's a balance." I understood his meaning. In finance, balance is more important than winning or losing. "Would you be interested in taking a formal position at the fund?" he continued. I was silent for a few seconds. "Please give me some time to think." He smiled. "This time, that time is yours." Those words made me realize something. For the first time in years, I was no longer being swept along by my circumstances. I had the right to choose. That night, I received a message from Sarah. Michael just held an internal press conference. He admitted to his managerial mistakes. I felt no stir upon reading the words. "How did he look?" I asked back. "Different from before. A lot of his sharp edges are gone." I put the phone down and looked out the balcony of my new apartment. The city under the lights was the same, but I had changed. 2 days later, Michael sent a short message. "I've taken care of your family's debt. It's all paid off." I stared at the text for a long time. Not because I was moved, but because I understood that this was his way of closing a chapter on his own. I called him back. "You didn't have to do that." "I needed to," his voice was calm. "It wasn't to get anything. It was just a responsibility." I took a deep breath. "Thank you." That was it. Nothing more. We didn't talk again. At the office, I started to participate in a new project, helping small and medium-sized enterprises build sustainable financial structures to avoid the kind of liquidity crisis I had witnessed. I realized I wanted to use this experience to help others avoid falling into the same vortex. One morning, as I was giving a presentation to a group of young startup founders, I suddenly saw a glimpse of my old self, a person who believed too much in one individual and forgot about the system and the risks. I told them something I had to learn at a very high cost. Never bet your entire future on a single person, no matter how brilliant they may seem. Those words weren't just for them. They were for the me of 8 years ago. One weekend, I received an invitation to attend a major financial conference. My name was on the list of speakers, under the role of risk analysis specialist. As I stood on the stage under the white lights, I no longer felt like I was standing behind someone. I was standing alone. And I wasn't afraid. After the conference, people approached me to shake my hand. Among them was a familiar face. It was Michael. He was wearing a simple suit, no longer with a flashy air. "Hello," he said. "Hello," I replied. We stood facing each other in the crowd. There was no more tension, no more anger. "I heard your presentation," he said. "It was very clear. I just spoke about what I've learned." He nodded. "I'm relearning too." I looked at him for a few seconds. "That's good." We didn't say anything more. There was no need for apologies or rehashing the past. Some things, without being repeated, were understood by both of us. As I left the convention center, I paused on the steps and took a deep breath of the night air. I remembered that day, standing in the cold hallway with the divorce decree in my hand. From then until now, everything seemed to have traced a steep curve. I was no longer a woman who trembled in the face of threats. I was no longer a person living to prove something to someone. I walked down the steps and blended into the crowd. The city was as bright as ever, the cars were still running, and life went on. But for me, this was the first moment I had truly stepped into the light, not from someone else's shadow, but from my own. I used to think this journey would end in a massive explosion, with one side completely destroyed and the other standing at the top. But that night, walking out of the convention center, I understood that not everything follows a movie script. There were no fireworks, no dramatic revenge. There were just people who had hit their limits and were forced to change. In the weeks that followed, my life slowed down to a surprisingly gentle pace. There were no more incessant late-night calls, no more bright red graphs covering my screen. I was still working at the fund, but no longer focused on the Meadowlands project. I was put in charge of a team assessing risk for new investments. The job demanded absolute coolness and objectivity. And for the first time, I found myself handling it calmly, without personal feelings getting in the way. One morning, Arthur Vance came to my desk. "Have you thought about my offer?" he asked. It was about the formal position. I nodded. Yes. I'll accept it, I replied. Not for the title or the money, but because I knew I was ready to stand in that spot. No longer in anyone's shadow. Around the same time, news about Michael's company gradually stabilized. The new management made more cautious decisions. Some projects were scaled back, and some assets were sold to reduce debt pressure. There were no more flamboyant expansion plans, no more personal press conferences. Instead, there was a quiet restructuring. Sarah still updated me with news from time to time. Michael doesn't appear in the media much anymore, she said in one call. He seems to be spending most of his time on internal work. Though she couldn't see it, I nodded. Perhaps he had understood the value of sustainability. Sarah was silent for a few seconds before asking, "Do you ever regret it?" I thought for a long time before answering. "No," I said. "But I'm not proud of it either." That was the truth. I didn't feel happy seeing the man who was once my husband brought low. But I also didn't regret protecting myself and my family. One afternoon, as I was preparing materials for a meeting, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. "Eleanor," his voice was calm. "I'd like to have a meal." "Why?" "I don't want to apologize or talk business." He paused for a moment. "Just a meal." I was silent. "I think we've said all there is to say." "Maybe," he said. "But some things should be properly finished." I thought for a few seconds. "All right," I agreed. We met at a small diner, not the fancy places where he used to host lavish parties. Michael was there first. When I entered, he stood up from his seat, a polite gesture I hadn't seen in a very long time. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I came to listen," I replied. The meal proceeded without any drama. He talked about the restructuring process, about having to learn to listen to the board's opinions, about the feeling of losing control and gradually coming to accept it. "I thought I could never be wrong," he said slowly. "Now I know where I went wrong." I didn't interrupt him. "And I know I hurt you." His voice dropped. "I don't expect you to forgive me." I put down my fork. "I don't live with resentment anymore," I said. "But I'm not going back either." He nodded. "I understand. We didn't bring up the past. We didn't mention the harsh words, the cold, contemptuous gazes. Some things, once they have passed, are best left alone." When the meal was over, he looked at me at the diner's door. "Take care," he said. "You too," I replied. I walked away without looking back. Not because I was being cold, but because I knew I had truly finished everything. Back in my apartment, I opened the balcony door and let the night breeze in. I remembered the first few days after I left our old home, when my mind was filled with confusion and self-loathing. If someone had told me then that I would end up here today, I wouldn't have believed them. Now, everything was no longer about war, or revenge, or proof. It was just a journey of growth for two people who had once been entangled and had hurt each other. I looked down at the lit-up streets and listened to the sound of cars in the distance. Life went on, stopping for no one. And I knew that the final part of this story was not about collapse, but about enlightenment. Some storms pass to destroy, and some pass to allow people to rebuild from scratch. But some storms target not houses or money, but arrogance and the illusions we build for ourselves. When my storm ended, I was not standing on ruins. I was standing in the middle of an empty plot of land, able to decide for myself what to build next. One morning at the end of the year, I was in my new office at the investment fund. The small nameplate on my desk wasn't very conspicuous, but it was enough to remind me of the long journey I had walked. I was no longer the neglected woman in my old marriage. I was no longer the person who quietly calculated every step to flip the board. I was just me, with a piece forged in experience and cracks. The Meadowlands project gradually stabilized. There were no more reckless expansion plans, no more articles praising phenomenal growth rates. Instead, there were clear financial reports, regular oversight meetings, and a slow but steady pace. I was no longer directly involved with that project, but I sometimes read the reports. Not out of curiosity, but because I wanted to see if the lessons were being correctly applied. One weekend afternoon, I went to visit my mother. The small house was the same, but my mother's face looked much more at peace than before. "You seem so different these days," my mother said as we sat drinking tea. "How so?" "You seem confident, but not heavy anymore." I laughed. "Maybe I've learned to let go." My mother looked at me for a long time. "Letting go is a good thing. But don't let your heart become hard." I nodded. I understood what she meant. Just because you've been hurt doesn't mean you should close your heart. That night, I received a message from Michael. It wasn't an apology or a proposition. It was just a picture of a company conference room with the caption, "First meeting with the new board. Learning from scratch." I looked at the picture for a few seconds before replying, "Be patient." That was it. I didn't feel a flutter or a twinge of discomfort when I saw his name on the screen. Just peace. My life no longer revolved around proving anything. I started to use my time for things I had put off. I took an advanced course in risk management. At night, instead of staring at stock charts, I read books. Every morning, as I jogged, I felt my own heartbeat, not the volatility of the market. Once, a young colleague asked me, "Ma'am, are you no longer afraid of failure?" I thought for a moment before answering. I am. But I don't let that fear control me. That's the biggest thing I learned. Not how to defeat others, but how to not be ruled by fear. A year after I held that divorce decree, I stood on the stage of another financial conference. This time, I didn't talk about my personal story. I talked about risk management, liquidity, and the dangers of over-relying on financial leverage. But in every sentence, I knew I was speaking from my own real experience. When the conference was over, a young woman approached me. "Ma'am, can you give me one piece of advice?" she asked. "Don't ever let anyone make you believe that your value depends on them," I replied. She smiled. As I watched her disappear into the crowd, I suddenly saw a glimpse of myself 8 years ago in her gaze. That night, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, looking down at the lit-up city. The wind gently brushed through my hair. I thought about the journey I had taken, from a neglected woman, to a person who quietly prepared every step. And then, to a person calm enough to know when to stop. I don't regret loving him. I don't regret leaving him. And I don't regret not helping him when he had to face the consequences of his own actions. Peace is not when there are no waves. Peace is when the waves have passed, and we are still standing firm. And today, I am standing firm.